Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator from Gibson's Bookstore, and I am joined tonight by two authors as we celebrate the launch day of Shawna Kay Rodenberg's new book, Kin, a Memoir. We are joined in conversation tonight by Shawna's friend and fellow author Benjamin Anastas. Kin, a Memoir is available from Gibson's Bookstore. Thank you to the two of you for joining us tonight. Let's get started. Are you ready to go?
We are ready. Shawna, it's such a privilege to be the person to talk to you, first in a formal way about your book. You've been talking to being interviewed and doing other kinds of media related things for the book, and you have plenty more events ahead. But this is so great for me and so gratifying, because when I met you, you were a poet who, I guess, you're still a poet, I'm sure, who was writing prose on the side or thinking about writing prose on the side. We talked a little bit about this book that you were thinking of writing. It was something that was you were just sort of dreaming about. And here you are.
Yeah, it was actually Mark, of course. We have to give him an immediate shout out.
This is Mark Wunder, like the director of Bennington Writing Seminars,
who was trying to coach me through my poems and said, they're getting kind of weighed down by all the story that I think you need to tell, and asked me if I wanted to write a memoir. And I said, no, no, thank you. Because it seemed, I don't know, like utterly counter to myself, my personality. And I liked the pretty veil of poetry. I like that feeling of not being known entirely. And of course, when you write a memoir, it feels private while you're writing it for a long time, and then it's just not, very abruptly and quickly, it's no longer a private endeavor, and it becomes a very public experience. And that was a real challenge for me, that shift, because I was, of course, raised in a town of less than 100 people, so very private childhood and life. And
those 100 or fewer than 100 other people probably knew all your business already.
Oh, they did, of course, but they didn't talk about it. And so I felt like that was definitely for me the first large hurdle, was the sort of shift from private to public, thinking about things privately versus publicly. And I feel like with poems, you get to kind of hold on to at least a semblance of some privacy, that you don't really have with memoir.
Mm-hmm. Before we talk about the book, I just wanted to ask you about Gibsons, the bookstore.
Yeah.
Do you have a history with Gibsons? I mean, I know you had some.
Yeah, I lived in Center Barnstead, New Hampshire for a while, which is about half an hour away from Gibsons. And, I had 3 babies in diapers at one time. And then, of course, 2 older children. So I had 5 in my party. And we used to go to Gibsons and hang out and read and not buy very much. So they were very kind to me, when I would spend the afternoon in their bookstore and then buy a postcard and go across. We would go down the street a little bit. There was a Viennese pastry maker named Franz. I think he's still there. And he would make the kids little marzipan animals. So the bookstore trips were really magical. It was a real treat. I also got a great children's book there in their clearance box about sex. It was called It's So Amazing. And every single one of my kids loved that book, read that book, hid it under their pillow. It was specifically made for kids, and it was smart and way ahead of its time, for the era. So I have a lot of happy memories at Gibsons.
It's funny to think of you in New Hampshire. I mean, I'm from just down 93 in Massachusetts.
I know.
it's, you were not a New Englander. I mean, you're a lot of
No.
things, but you were not a New Englander.
No, I am
So
not.
I wonder what it was like for you to be, from Letcher County, and you lived in other places too, like Minnesota, but what was it like to
Yeah.
be like from Letcher County and be in New Hampshire?
Well, I was really lucky because I sort of fell in. I had a neighbor who owned a farm. We had 40 acres on a hill called Beauty Hill Road. And my neighbor had this big, beautiful farm, and she was a homeschooling mom. And I sort of fell in with this whole crowd of very supportive, very farm-oriented homeschooling moms, and that just suited our family very well. They had twice as, one family had twice as many kids as I did, so we felt like the very small, contained family, wherever we went, which was unusual, that feeling. Um, but I had a lot of support from women who were raising their kids in the country, and exploring what kind of the lakes in the area and the blueberries and the beauty of New Hampshire. It's a pretty place.
Because this is how I think of you. And I met you when you were a student at Bennington Writing Seminars, and you're studying poetry, getting your master's. And there was already this sort of the mythology around you, like, oh, there's Shawna, she's like homeschooling all the kids, there's an incredible family. And then like the family would show up, and it was like your family. It's like you were of the world and not of the world. You're like
Oh,
both.
that's really
It's like you're both
sweet.
mortal and divine. Like the reading like Plato's Symposium under the tree, or like
Yeah,
listening to one of the operas in the Ring Cycle, and like reading the score along with it. And you're just like, who are these people? Like, how are
we
human beings
still do
like
all
this
that
now?
stuff.
How are human beings like? How do people lead a life like this now?
Yeah, well, thank you. That's very kind. You don't see the behind the scenes, lunacy
No, of
and
course not.
screaming and.
But I think that's one of that to me. That's one of the things that makes. I mean, it's source material, but it's one of the things that makes this book so special. It's that you've managed to, the memoir is like a well-worn form, and we feel like we've read memoirs about about hard childhoods before. We've read memoirs about Appalachia before. We've read memoirs about religious, growing up in religious communities or religious cults before. But there's something that animates this book that is entirely singular, and I think it's just like your approach to life and your approach to writing.
Thank you.
And so the book starts with this visit to Letcher County, where you no longer live, but your parents still live, by a CBS producer. And I think this is really like one of the real strokes of genius. Like, you start out with the scene where you're essentially like the unpaid guide, right? Which has become this
Oh,
sort of
yeah,
sideline for you. Like, you feel very conflicted about it. Maybe talk
I
a little bit about
do.
that visit and then we'll have you read, and then maybe you can read something.
Okay. Yeah, it was, I was actually, at the time, I was teaching community college through KCTCS, that's the Kentucky Community College System. And so I was back and forth all the time between Indiana, where I now live, and Kentucky. And I was approached by CBS. They had read an article that I'd written that was pretty controversial. I didn't know it was going to be when I wrote it, but it ended up being so, because it was about education in Appalachia, specifically in Martin County. And I had kind of been put through the ringer for writing it because there were people who felt like it painted too negative a picture, and I think it hurt feelings, even though my intention was to help draw attention to the fact that I thought that these kids that I was teaching, they were dual credit students. They were high school students who were working to get college credits through the community college, and they were all pushed. There had been dynamite. It was the highway that they were blasting, but it had damaged one of the schools, and they had all been moved into a middle school. And so I wrote a piece about that, and that was how the CBS producer found me. But I had actually been asked not to teach the kids after I wrote the piece. So I had already sort of paid a price, for writing at a personal price. And then I had this, this role of bringing this news crew through Sico and Whitesburg, Kentucky, and Letcher County, Kentucky, because even people who spend their lives traveling all over the country, I think they find Appalachia intimidating sometimes. It feels like its own thing within the country, sort of its own country. And so, she had asked me for certain things that she wanted to see while she was there. Some of them bothered me.
And in the book, you sort of you list all the things that you wanted to do. There's like a B-roll of you walking through the fields, and they wanted to see some Trump signs, and they wanted to see a dollar store, and it was like a lot of stereotypical.
A diner. There's always a diner. Yeah. Something about diners. I don't know what that is.
And you're like, hey, there actually aren't any Trump signs around here, but the cameraman, the cameraman ends up being a Trump supporter.
He does. And so, I felt like in that situation, I felt like the news, the people who distribute information about America to America were looking for this magical Trump supporter that fit a particular image that they had. And he was right there all along. And so that was sort of what the prologue was born from.
And I think that's really the first time you introduce what you feel, which is like this fierce loyalty to the region where you were born, and its people, starting with your loyalty to your family, but yet it's conflicted by it's conflicted by these frustrations you have, and the fact that that there are times when you feel entirely at home, but there are other times when you feel like a complete outsider.
Oh yeah,
because you disagree about things like education and women's right to choose.
Sometimes politics, yeah. So it's a complicated. It's a tightrope, and I feel like I've been straddling those two spaces for a while now. I definitely felt like I was straddling them in New Hampshire, like I was being one thing around the people that I spent my time with, but there was this other self that is, obviously always going to be Appalachian, whatever that means to each individual.
Is there a section you want to read?
Yeah, I thought I would read the way the book is structured. I didn't actually do this intentionally, but I kind of realized after the fact that I sort of ended up structuring it kind of, I think, like the Bible. So there's an Old Testament, which is sort of this period of wandering that my family did. And there are a lot of family mythology stories in that part, sort of context, history, family.
And this is when your parents were part of the body?
Yeah. It starts there. Yeah. I would have been 4. And then I sort of flash back to some of my mom's experiences and her stories that she told me, that were kind of like her origin story. They seemed to have real significance to her. So she told them to me over and over again. So there's that. And I think of, sort of in the Old Testament, there are all the begats. And that's kind of the first half of Ken is the begats and the sort of setting up the family stories. And then there's this chapter that I'm going to read from, which is sort of, I think of kind of like the Canaan chapter. And it's when we finally made it to Sico, to Fletcher Hill, to where my family was. And I was going to read to you from that section. So
great.
I'll do that. And the way that the chapter is structured, so it's initially I called it the funeral chapter, because part of the sadness of moving back to Kentucky was that I had all of a sudden all this family, this extended family, but I also began losing members of that family immediately. And in the first year, I lost my grandpa, who I was very close to, and 2 of my uncles, Jesse and Tommy. And and so I think the only things you need to know is that Tommy was one of those uncles, that in the mountains, the streets are often so narrow that people make what are called turning places, which is sort of like digging a place out in the hill so you can turn a car around. And that my Mama May, who's my mother's mother, used to care for a woman who was they called Little May, who was a ward of the state. And she had many afflictions, including rickets, but she was bedfast in a crib. I think that's all. Oh, also, my grandpa used to paint the bottom of our fruit trees with white latex paint and lime to protect them from the cold and bugs. And so I think that's all you need to know. And it's also Sico. It's not Seco. Everyone thinks it's Seco, but it's an acronym for Southeast Coal Company. So it's Sico. We were so high up on the hill that venturing to the edge of the deck gave me butterflies. And when the trees had shed their leaves, I could see all the way to Whitaker, or Zigstown, as some people called it, where my great-grandma Dora, Grandpa's mom, was buried in the cemetery of the Free Will Baptist Church, and where my mom's brother Ronnie lived with his wife and their 5 blonde-haired daughters. Across the way, on the opposite mountain, cars navigated the exaggerated curves of the road, and below us, on the other side of the creek that separated Sico from the rest of the world, an old farmer was always out in his garden, one of the only cleared plots of flat land around, wide and generous enough to feed him for most of the year. We called the scattered row houses along the creek bottom downtown Sico, though the coal mines had closed nearly 30 years before, and with each passing year, another house or two disappeared, torn down or fallen in. Soon after our arrival, the house Mom had lived in went the way of the latter. Only remnants of the town lingered, a few row houses, the hammered metal bathhouse where miners could rinse the first layer of coal dust from their bodies before walking home, the white clapboard post office and Methodist church, the only official buildings in a town that had once had its own school and hospital. It seemed to me like the prettiest graveyard, the scattered remains of another time gathered around the massive shuttered company turned general store, which rose from the center of everything like an ancient church, its porch stacked high for some mysterious reason with old televisions. Suddenly, I had so much family, so many cousins to play with. I could hardly believe how many people knew me. They dropped by and we dropped by, which felt like going to parties all the time. Most of my cousins lived in other nearby coal and former coal towns, so they went to different schools. But they all made me feel like I belonged and always had, like they'd been waiting for me to come back. A few of the faces I recalled from the earliest recesses of my memory at Mama May's funeral, which happened right before we left for Minnesota when I was still very little. Most of my Addington family were old regular Baptists, and May's funeral was held at the Little Rock Old Regular Baptist Church in Kona, one of the first old regular churches in the birthplace of old regular churches. May's mother, Bertha Collier, was a member of the same church, and Bertha's funeral had been held there too, though she'd been dead 10 years by the time I was born. "Who is that?" I'd asked at May's funeral. I had only seen her barefaced in curlers and a house dress. I didn't recognize her in the lipstick and brightly colored suit she was wearing. Mom was crying so hard that strands of her bleached platinum hair were glued to her cheeks. The church body had gathered around the coffin to sing lined out hymns, unaccompanied since instruments were not allowed, stretching each word out so long the songs were indecipherable but familiar. It sounded like weeping in time. Mama May had sung to herself that way when Mom and I visited her from Ohio. Sometimes little May chimed in, her voice thin as a whistle. They never sang about anything but Jesus. "It's May," Mom said, her body stock still, like she was holding her breath. I'd never heard her say her mother's name out loud, and I was too little to understand that Mom was only 23 and had already lost both her parents and all 4 grandparents. After the funeral, I remember kicking through piles of wet, matted leaves, trying not to be sad. Little May died soon after. May had been sick for a while and made arrangements for a replacement for her charge, but little May refused to eat for anyone else. They had lived together for more than a decade, so little May was family, and her stories became part of ours, woven in with such great care the edges of each were imperceptible. So there's also a hog killing in this chapter, and I'll skip past that and then read one more section.
Great, thank you.
Laura Ingalls' family raised their hogs by letting them run wild in the Wisconsin woods, feeding on acorns and roots. But we slopped ours with a mix of pellets Dad bought from the feed store, and table scraps wetted down with whatever we weren't eating, cottage cheese that had turned, half-empty cans of vegetables pulled from the back of the fridge, a bag of flour infested by weevils. Dad said the only thing they wouldn't eat was cucumbers, which made you wonder about cucumbers, and meat, of course. In his new job, he spent 3 days at a time at the fire department, bunking above the engine bay, and Mom started work at Rite Aid. But even when she was home, she was so tired she usually got straight into her nightgown and lay down on the couch to twirl her hair and watch television. So the chores, including feeding the hogs, fell to me. The hog pen was shaded by the tree line and surrounded by a single wire of electric fencing, which Dad said didn't need to be on once they'd been shocked the first time. They were so smart. But he left it on just the same. He said, unlike Pa Ingalls, there'd be no way he could catch them if they got out. All summer long and then after school and on the weekends, Misty and I were usually home alone, and we took full advantage, playing until well after dark with some neighbor girls, though Mom fussed about it because they lived without plumbing or running water and often had lice. So we were warned not to set foot inside their house. But we played every game we could think of, and then we made up our own games. We explored Fletcher Hill, climbing all the way to the top, which was flat, eroded by eons of wind and rain. The climb took the better part of an afternoon. Sometimes we packed a picnic. The neighbor girls would bring a plastic bread bag filled with breaded fried squirrel brains, making Misty and me self-conscious about our fancier bologna on white bread sandwiches, or the cans of potted meat Grandma donated. Sometimes we found enough change for a can of Country Time lemonade from the single vending machine on the porch of the company store. We played a game I called Princess, dividing the hillside into 4 equal quadrants, one realm for each of us to rule over. On mine, I built a tiny castle of rocks, scrap plywood, and branches I cut with a pocket knife, just large enough for the 4 of us to squat inside and hold princess meetings. Between the meetings, we played veterinarian with stray cats and dogs, pulling wolfworms from their necks with matches and tweezers, and engorged ticks from the clusters on their backs, stomping and smearing the ticks into red swirls across the blacktop. When we ran out of ticks, we stomped clusters of pokeberries to finish our pictures. I made up a story that one of the cats, an orange tabby, was an alien, and they pretended to believe me for days as we followed the cat around, hoping we might be there when it let its guard down and showed us who it really was. We shook Grandpa's apple trees and gorged ourselves on the spicy apples, then stomped the rotting, wind-felled piles into orange-brown mush, yellow jackets and all. Grandma gave me her old washboard, the same one she'd scrubbed Dad's diapers on decades before, and we had laundry day with our baby doll's clothes. Thanks to his garbage haul, Grandpa kept us in bikes, and we let them fly down the steepest hills in Sico, raising our hands in the air like we were praising the Lord. I wrecked so many times I ended up with coal dust in my knee, a permanent tattoo I showed proudly to anyone who would look. When we finished daredeviling, we flipped our bikes on their sides and pretended the wheels were millstones, picking handfuls of grasses to grind into wheat flour. We choreographed dances to our favorite country songs. Mine were Swingin' by John Anderson and Nobody by Sylvia. Huddled around a radio Grandpa gave us, we chatted and waited until a song we liked came on, then jumped to our assigned places. More often than not, I forgot about the Hogs until well after dark, when the only lights that shone against the midnight green of the hillside came from my grandparents' windows and the moon if it was up. The slop buckets were heavy and cumbersome, but I zigzagged up the hillside along the paths I came to know by heart, paths my own feet had helped make, and then above that, where there were no paths and the tall grass tugged at my ankles, coaxing me to lie down and catch my breath, to gaze at the sky full of glittering stars under the sick smell until the sick smell of the slop roused me again. Hidden in the dark of the mountain, I was alone, but not alone. My grandparents were one call for help away. My sister and mother comfortable in front of the TV. I could see the flashing lights from where I lay. I could not see our neighbors, but I could hear their muffled talking from the shadow of their own porches. By the time I made it to the hog pen, I was usually so distracted, I felt the jolt and froze in confusion before I realized what had happened, that I'd bumped into the fence again. The hot wire came to the tops of my thighs, but I didn't feel it there first. Instead, it was a hand tightening around the back of my neck, then a pulse that held me until I could remember how to let go. It made hanging on to the buckets a kind of endurance test, and more than once, after I dropped them and wasted the slop, I tossed them at the Hogs in a fit of temper, just like my dad and Grandpa would have done. Though the Hogs never seemed to mind or even notice, they only cared that I fed them. How I loved our new life on the mountain. At night, instead of witches and needles, my dreams were full of warm cookies, new coats, and yellow moons, vibrating close enough to the hilltop that I could cup them in my palms. On Sundays, we walked with Grandma to the Methodist church in the Bottoms, where old people sang about heaven and let me teach Sunday school if any other kids showed up. Afterward, Grandma fixed a big, rich pot of chicken and dumplings, and I ate until I felt sick. Sometimes when our bellies were full, Dad read aloud from the Bible or his favorite books, The Thread That Runs So True, or The Little Shepherd of Kingdom Come, while I lay with my head in Mom's lap as she tickle-scratched my arms and clucked over my wild, uncombed hair. A secret. When I had finished slopping the Hogs, I often sat in the center of the turning place and rested my back against it, like I was a giantess and the earth was my humongous chair. The princess game we played wasn't imaginary. Part of that great mountain belonged to me, silly, insignificant girl that I was. I'll stop there.
Oh, that's beautiful, Shawna. You refer to Fletcher Hill as my family's mountain in the book.
Yeah, it is. That's where they are.
And yet Sico, it's a company town. It's named. I didn't realize. I guess I'd forgotten that it's named for Southeast Coal Company.
Yeah, a lot of towns around there are. You have Vico, which is the Virginia Intermont or Interstate something coal company. Any of the towns in Eastern Kentucky that live in Co. Those are coal towns. I mean, many of them are coal towns, but they are for sure if the name ends in Co.
And we were emailing a little bit about this, and you were talking about the coal industry and like the and how American the story of the coal industry is, and there's your family playing its role. I mean, I guess your grandfather worked in the mines, right? And I mean,
yeah.
how enmeshed in coal was or is your family?
Well, I still have many uncles and cousins that work in coal still. My grandpa, all my grandparents except one, and that was just because he was out west. So he was a lumberman instead of a coal man. But essentially all of my ancestors. I had ancestors that had a little bit more money and sold the mineral rights. They were sort of responsible for that whole deal, at least in part. And then I had family members who worked in the mines. And I had my grandfather, who I talked about, who dies in that chapter. He died of black lung, and then my mother's father also worked in the mines, and he died of related issues. And so it's just been part of my family's history and mythology and identity for a really long time. I think that's an aspect of coal that people don't talk about. It's not just a job, it becomes a kind of identity as well. So therein lies the rub.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I do want to get to questions, but I guess there's just one or two other things I wanted to bring up before we get there. Your father plays a very big role in the book because of the way you butted heads. The kind of conflict. You talk about the sin of rebellion.
Right.
I feel like you keep on committing the sin of rebellion, particularly when it comes to sort of rebelling against his wishes.
Right. I think he had the same issue, though. We were, I think, in large part, my mom always said we butted heads because we were so much alike. And I think that's true in a lot of families. We had too much in common, and sometimes that isn't helpful. But yeah, he had to go his own way too. He had, that's why the second half of the book, the New Testament of the book, sort of follows his story, because I kind of realized in the middle of writing it that he and I had such similar experiences. They were parallel almost in our search for our own paths and our own identities. And it's hard to reinvent yourself when you come from a small place. It's hard to figure out how to make a life that is the life that you want, because you don't even know what that is. So it requires a certain bravery and sort of this feeling of jumping off a precipice, into the unknown, because everything outside the mountains is unknown. So I think we had that in common.
And at the same time that your father is such a central figure, I mean, the women in the book, in some ways play even more of a role. I mean, they're the chapters that are about your mother's early life. There are the teachers, Mrs. Cheney, Mrs. Murtaugh.
Yeah.
There are the grandmothers. I mean, and I mean, it's funny, in your part of your reading, you mentioned Little House on the Prairie. In the Little House series. I just wonder if you'd just say a few words about the role that women played in your childhood and what you kind of tried to capture in writing the book.
Well, that's really, I think, if there's any part of the book that I'm really proud of, it's that, because when I was growing up as a little girl, I always loved books that were about women moving into a difficult space, and making it beautiful in spite of difficult circumstances, whether it was The Secret Garden or Little House on the Prairie, or more recently, The Master Butcher Singing Club, or Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. Those are the books that I love, where women sort of utilize this focus on their feats, essentially, but in a very small and pragmatic way. And those attributes of women, I think, are what makes the world bearable to live in. For me, have always been what made the world bearable, was that there were all these women around me who were always doing their best to soften the edges of difficult experiences, to create a treat, in a very difficult circumstance, to tell a joke when things hit the fan, or what have you. And I've tried to do that in my own life. And when I read books that deal with that women's work, that traditionally thought of women's work. And I'm not just talking about domestic life, I'm talking about making art, and, raising your kids to be whole. And there's just a lot of ways to make beauty in life. And I've always admired women for that. So I tried to do as much of that in my book as I could. It's in every chapter. So basically, there's always a woman making something better. Because we try. We try.
Do you have one more brief reading before we take questions? Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I could read the end of that chapter.
Great.
I didn't want to read for too long. I feel it's, you never know with the Zoom situation how people are feeling. Okay, this is the end of that chapter. I spared you all the funerals and the hog killing. You have to read the book to get that part. Later that year, there was a flood, catastrophic enough to be on the evening news, though it didn't seem so to me at the time. Our house was safe, but the row houses downtown filled with muddy water, swirling with trash and debris that spilled over from the creek banks until most of Sico became a shallow lake, a moat around Fletcher Hill. Grandma warned us, mostly me, to stay out of the water. She said floods were more dangerous than they looked, and I obeyed her for a time, content to watch from the porches as the swollen creek rushed below, loud as a waterfall. I wondered where the packs of stray dogs that argued with us on our graveyard walks and grapevine swings over the creek. I hoped they had somehow known, like Grandma said they would, to get to higher ground. She reminded me that there was already a body count and that some families would never recover from the flood. She asked me to imagine all the family photos and heirlooms that had washed away. She didn't want to hear me talk about stray dogs. She must have figured out that I was going to disobey and walk down to the water's edge because she appeared out of nowhere and offered to come with me, placing her hand in mine. We did this often, holding hands and walking to the post office, the church, and Grandpa's grave in the cemetery at Whitaker next to his mother. The closer we got to the water's edge, churning and lapping at the base of the hill, the quieter she grew. She said she knew it made no difference to him now, but she didn't like to imagine him under all that water. Then she surprised me and said we would wade in just to see. She rolled up the legs of her slacks and carefully placed her tennis shoes on a stump where they wouldn't be washed away. I was wearing a skirt, and I held it above the water until I grew bored of being careful and let the hymn float around me. She said all the mean creatures in the creek, the granddaddy crawdads and giant snapping turtles and razor-mouthed catfish, were probably having a big time swimming past our feet where we couldn't see them. I wondered if there were family heirlooms floating along beside them, treasures that had been preserved for years, even when it would have made more sense to hawk them to pay bills or fill a refrigerator with food. I wished I had a net I could cast for them and return them to the people who'd lost them. She let me wade until I was finished, and we walked back up the hill, soggy and cold. I asked if she would make me a peanut butter milkshake, and she said she would, even though she thought it was too cold to drink a milkshake. Our hands still clasped, she pulled me along faster than I wanted to go, her long legs taking the mountain in strides. Even then, I had so many memories of Grandma's strength, which seemed exaggerated against Mom's stillness. Where Mom tired quickly doing housework, it seemed to give Grandma more energy as she went along. Mom's dislike for heat often kept her from cooking at the stove, but Grandma pulled hot pans from the oven without mitts. Mom liked being indoors, but Grandma spent every moment she could in her flower gardens, and especially after Grandpa died, was always trying to convince someone to drive her somewhere. I remembered being stuck in the ice on a hill in Mayking, Grandma, Misty, and me, with Mom driving. Grandma had a job babysitting for Aunt Linda, and Mom was giving her a lift to work. We spun and slid all over the road as the car crept up the mountain at a snail's pace. Grandma didn't want to be late for work, so she climbed from the car and pushed us up the hill. Her strength seemed boundless to me, but I knew it wasn't, and that if my life was going to be anything like my own mother's, Grandma would be gone long before I was ready, as would Mom and everybody I loved. She slowed down when we were back in her yard and knelt to pull some weeds from a damp patch of flower bed. Above her on the hill, I noticed that one of my favorite apple trees looked sickly and realized there had been no late summer crop that year of the spicy, thin-skinned yellow fruit. There was nothing but dead grass around the trunk, where piles of the apples should have been browning and rotting, feeding the tree for the coming year. The white skirting that ringed the trunk was chipped and faded, and animals had gnawed bare patches in the bark, exposing the wood beneath to the elements, and just in time for winter. Grandma said she guessed none of our trees would last long without Grandpa to care for them, and she was right about that too.
Thank you so much, Shawna.
Thank
Elizabeth, I
you.
think we're ready for questions. I can read them if you'd like to. I don't know how you want to do
I'm
it.
here. I'm ready to go. Thank you to our audience members. If you have questions, now is the time to type them into the chat or the Q&A box. Kin is available from Gibson's Bookstore, and congratulations, Shawna, on your launch day once more. Let us start with our first question here from Janine, who asks, knowing that your book would no longer be a private matter, what drove you to write it?
That's a really good question. Well, initially it was my mentor, Mark Wunderlich, who I mentioned earlier. He kind of tricked me, and he said, just write it like you're writing it for your children. Don't think about an audience. You know, this is just for you. This is just for them. And there really wasn't ever a moment where I thought, okay, you know, now I'm going to go public or whatever. We were kind of talking about that earlier. It's really more of like I would say that it's a better comparison to think about, you know, how they say if you put lobsters in water and then heat it up, you know, like over time they get cooked and don't know it, instead of like dropping them into the boiling water. It was more like that. So um it was more of a sense of needing to tell the story for future generations, but not really ever thinking it would go anywhere. And then it did. And I kind of had to deal with that reality. And it's a beautiful reality, but it was a change, you know, it was definitely a shift for me.
Excellent. Marion says, hi, Shawna Kay. I just received Kin this afternoon and look forward to reading it. And I wonder how the poems you were writing in your MFA program informed and perhaps morphed into your memoir. It's clear from your reading you have a poet's observational skills, such as the old regular Baptist singing sounded like weeping. So I'm curious how one genre served another genre for you.
I think that all genres serve other genres. And I think that's kind of true across the board of art in general. And I think that for me, poetry is very it's visceral, and it's the experience of it is hypersensory, and it's all about observation. And that's what you need in memoir. You know, that's the skill that you need to write memoir, is the power of observation. I think not just of your surroundings, but of yourself. You know, the ability to turn that observing eye inward, I think. Yeah. So poetry definitely helps you be introspective. And I would say, in my experience, and I think it helped me in that way. I do write really long chapters, though. You would think that my poetry would have helped me be more concise, but my chapters are kind of long.
Well, it's got to go somewhere. If it's not going into your poetry, I'll have to go somewhere else. All right, so
I have a question for you, Shawna. How does someone get a blurb from Rosanne Cash? I mean,
don't ask me.
Kin disturbed me and hypnotized me in ways very few memoirs have. Rosanne Cash, the Rosanne Cash. How does that happen?
That one made me cry. I cried for a long time about that one, because one of the original versions of the Fletcher Hill chapter contained her. You know, I used to make my cousins, I was such a bossy girl. I used to make my cousins perform to songs. And one of those songs was 7-Year Ache, Rosanne Cash's 7-Year Ache, and also the Tennessee Flat Top Box. I loved that song too for some reason. But she was I thought she was so cool, you know, because she was country. She was Johnny Cash's daughter. What could be cooler? But she was also like, she had like a very stylish urban sensibility. So she was like the best of all worlds, kind of, and I wrote her into two earlier versions of the chapter that we ended up not using. So it seemed crazy to me that she blurbed the book, because she was even in it for a period of time. And I was kind of sad that she wasn't in the final version, but I did not get that blurb. Someone did that favor for me. I don't know who. Probably my editor, Anton Mueller, who has been wonderful. Just a godsend of an editor. So.
Well, now you need to release those excerpts of the deleted scenes on your website, or that's a pre-order promo. Anybody who pre-ordered gets, don't quote me on that. I didn't agree to this ahead of time. That's really wonderful. That must be, that's the kind of thing that you print and like frame on your wall, like Rosanne Cash.
I just couldn't believe it. I know it seemed unreal to me. And also just knowing like how I've been following their stories I actually have an essay coming out in Elle magazine soon about Dolly Parton and Loretta Lynn, because I'm related to Loretta Lynn. And so kind of, I'm also related through marriage to Rosanne Cash, because I have relatives who, Maybelle Carter, June Carter's mom, June Carter Cash's mom is a great aunt of mine. So I'm even, I kind of grew up like bragging that Rosanne Cash was like a very distant cousin, so it just seemed unreal to me that she was going to be part of the book,
That's such a wonderful story. So we have another question here. So is there anything that you discovered about the family or your life when you were writing, specifically, when you are remembering childhood memories in detail from an adult perspective? Without spoiling the book.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The process for me, I thought I knew what a memoir was. I love memoir and I read memoir like chocolate, I think it's such a beautiful art form. And of course, the storyteller in me and the history of storytelling in my family, I think just predisposes me to loving the form. I'm sorry. You have to repeat that question. I forgot what I was saying.
Childhood memories through an adult perspective?
Yeah. So what I realized was that I think one thing memoir teaches you is how little you do remember, and how you've got this narrative of your life. We learn to talk to each other kind of in sound bites, about our stories. And memoir is about sort of getting rid of those little easy answers and explanations for things, and really kind of looking at the reality of what you do know. And there are memories that you're certain about, there are memories that you're not as certain about, there are memories within the family that no one can agree on, even if everyone was there at the same time. And I think I learned a lot in my research, because I'm sort of obsessed with genealogy, about my past, my ancestors, but I also learned a lot about myself and how little I understood about the events that had led me kind of on my way. And I really think, in that way, it made me wish everybody would write a memoir, that I feel like every person in the world, whether they are published or not, would benefit from putting pen to paper and thinking about what you actually do know about yourself and what happened to you. And it's really surprising, I think, or at least it was for me, to kind of realize how many connections I hadn't made, and how so much more of my story made sense once it was all kind of laid out and strung together.
Well, Kin is available from Gibson's Bookstore. Gibson's Bookstore is available for in-store browsing. We offer online ordering, shipping, curbside pickup as well. Thank you so much, Shawna Kay Rodenberg, for joining us tonight. Congratulations on the launch of your book, which is getting some good reviews, which is wonderful. I know you said you'd been staying off of social media today, which is probably the best mental health strategy.
Right. Yeah.
And thank you so much to Benjamin Anastas for joining us in conversation this evening as well. And to our audience members joining us from home, thank you for sharing this day with us, with Shawna. Thank you so much to everybody. Any final thoughts to leave us with?
Everyone should read this book.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben, for
Thanks,
everything. And thank you, Elizabeth, too. You guys
Thank
are
you
wonderful.
so much to everybody. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.